Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom. Today, we're diving into a really pivotal moment in the history of governance, and we're drawing from the incredible research of Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir in his book, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence. Specifically, we're looking at the volume that covers the era of Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab. May Allah be pleased with him. We're going to explore how a state, growing at an incredible speed, faced a massive crisis. And out of that crisis, created one of the world's first true central finance ministries. It's an amazing story about building systems of justice that are designed to last for generations. So let's just start with the main problem, the central question of the day. Imagine for a second that you are the leader of this state, and it's growing at a pace that is just breathtaking. Territories that took other empires centuries to bring under their control are now your responsibility, and it's happened in just a few years. So how do you do it? How do you possibly manage the wealth of all these new lands, provide for millions of new citizens, and pay the soldiers defending these huge new borders, all while making sure everything is done with absolute justice? Now, this wasn't just some thought experiment. It was the urgent, pressing reality for the early Islamic State. And the answer they came up with? Well, it would change public administration forever. And to really get a sense of the scale here, you have to look at the timeline. By the year 18 after Hijrah, the Islamic State had completely transformed. It wasn't just a community based around a single city in the Arabian Peninsula anymore. Not at all. It was now a global power, and it was administering these ancient, incredibly wealthy and complex lands. We're talking Persia, the Levant, Egypt. And this meant inheriting these sophisticated economies, these established agricultural systems, and really diverse populations, all with their own long-standing traditions and ways of doing things. The old informal methods of collecting and sharing funds, the ones that worked perfectly for a small community built on trust, well, they were now dangerously out of date. A new vision was desperately needed. And think about it. The state's responsibilities had just exploded in complexity. This wasn't just about collecting some money anymore. It was about funding a modern government. It meant you needed a standing professional army that needed regular salaries to defend thousands of miles of frontier. It meant paying a whole new class of public servants, people like governors, judges, and engineers, in provinces that were a long, long way from the capital. It meant investing in major public works, like digging canals and building roads. It also meant you had to have reserves set aside to provide relief during a crisis, like the devastating famine that came to be known as the Year of Ashes. And so critically, this social contract, this promise of care, it extended to all citizens. This included the established Christian and Jewish communities, whose protection and welfare were a guaranteed responsibility of the state. So the crucial point becomes crystal clear. You simply cannot run a superstate on an unpredictable income stream like war booty or voluntary charity. It's just not possible. A government that needs to plan for the future needs a financial backbone that is stable so it can actually plan budgets and plan ahead. It needs a system that is lawful so that every single citizen understands their rights and their obligations. And it must be auditable so that the leadership and, just as importantly, the public can be absolutely certain that the people's wealth is being managed with total integrity. That old collection culture where a local official just gathered whatever funds based on custom, it wasn't just inefficient anymore, it was a direct threat to the state itself. In fact, this lack of a formal system created a dangerous power vacuum, and into that vacuum crept four huge, fundamental threats. These weren't just dangers to the Treasury's bottom line. Oh no, they attacked the state's very commitment to justice, to fairness, and to trust. Okay, threat number one, the most immediate one, was arbitrary power. Just try to put yourself in the shoes of a farmer in the Nile Delta for a moment. One year, the local tax collector shows up, he assesses your land, and he demands a fair percentage of your wheat harvest. Okay, fair enough. But then the next year, a totally different collector arrives, and with no new law, no clear reason at all, he demands double that amount. What do? Who can you possibly appeal to? This kind of uncertainty, it created fear, it created resentment. Without a standardized, legally defined code, every single citizen was left completely vulnerable to the personal judgment or maybe even the greed of local officials. This wasn't just bad economics, it was undermining the very legitimacy of the state. Second, there was this massive problem of corruption and leakage. Now, the journey from a provincial capital in, say, Persia, all the way to the central treasury, the Bayt al-Māl in Medina, was incredibly long and difficult. Without strict mandatory reporting, without auditing procedures, there were just countless opportunities for funds to get lost. Some of it might be skimmed by corrupt officials. Some could be misspent on unauthorized local projects. And some might just vanish because of bad record keeping. The central government was essentially flying blind. It couldn't effectively plan or distribute the nation's wealth because it never had a real picture of what was actually being collected out there. The third threat was a political one: disintegration. You see, the new empire was not all the same. Some provinces, like Egypt, were unbelievably wealthy agricultural powerhouses. Others were developing frontier regions, vital for defense, but they were pretty poor by comparison. Now, if each province was just allowed to keep and spend its own revenue, a really dangerous imbalance would start to grow. The rich provinces would get richer, more self-sufficient, while the poorer regions would struggle, and that would breed resentment and really weaken the unity of the entire state. A true empire needed a way to share the wealth, where the surplus from the prosperous areas could be used to support the needs of the whole, making sure there was stability and shared prosperity for absolutely everyone. And finally, we come to what might be the most profound threat to individual justice. There was no right of appeal. If you, as that farmer we talked about, felt that you were taxed unfairly, what was your next step? In an informal system like this, there's no clear path. You could maybe complain to the local governor, but there was no standardized legal process that forced him to investigate. There was no independent body to appeal to. This feeling of powerlessness for the ordinary citizen in the face of the state, it's corrosive. It creates a government that rules by decree, not by a transparent and accessible system of law. And this, right here, gets to the absolute heart of the issue. These weren't just logistical headaches or simple accounting errors. No way. Each one of these four threats was a direct assault on the state's founding principles. They were constitutional crises waiting to happen. They violated the promise of justice, they were destroying the essential bond of trust between the government and its people, and ultimately, they were harming the public interest. A simple patch wasn't going to fix this. What was needed was a deep, structural, and constitutional solution, and it had to happen fast. All right, so with the scale of this crisis now clear, let's turn to the truly elegant and revolutionary solution that was created. This was the establishment of a brand new, permanent state institution, and it was known as the Diwān al-Kharāj. Let's break down that name. Diwan is a word with Persian origins, and it means a register, an archive, or a government office. Kharāj refers specifically to the tax on agricultural land, which, let's be honest, was the main source of revenue for pretty much every pre-modern state. So the Diwān al-Kharāj was quite simply the central government office for land tax and public revenue. It was a permanent professional body of civil servants. Their job was to manage the entire financial life cycle of the state, from assessing how productive the land was, to collecting the tax, to reporting the income, and then auditing the whole process to make sure everything was done according to the law. And to put this historical concept into words we can immediately get, what was created here was, for all intents and purposes, a Ministry of Finance. Now, this was an absolutely astonishing leap forward in the history of governance. It signaled a huge move away from governing through personal authority and a move toward governing through impartial institutions. This professional bureaucracy, totally dedicated to the sound and just management of public funds, is one of the key things that separates a temporary conquest from a true, lasting state. And its design was just brilliant. It addressed each of those four threats head-on. Step 1, standardized land assessment, based on what crop was being grown and how it was irrigated. That directly solved the problem of arbitrary taxation. Step 2, uniform collection procedures. This meant fairness and predictability for every citizen, no matter where they lived. Step 3, mandatory, detailed provincial reporting. This was the direct antidote to corruption and leakage, because now every single coin had to be accounted for. And finally, Step 4, integrating all the funds into the central treasury and conducting audits. This solved provincial inequality and gave citizens a legal basis to appeal unfair assessments. It was a comprehensive, structural fix for the whole system. But the impact of this reform went so much further than just balancing the books. This was a constitutional shift. It fundamentally redefined the relationship between the state and its citizens, and it established a precedent for public administration that would echo for centuries to come. I mean, just look at this comparison. It really shows the sheer scale of the transformation. The system went from being arbitrary and personal, where your fate literally depended on the character of one official, to being lawful and standardized, based on a clear set of rules that applied equally to everyone. It went from being unauditable and based on discretion to being fully accountable and structural. The system itself, not the person running it on any given day, became the ultimate guarantor of financial justice. So, if there is one single thing to take away from our explainer today, let it be this. By creating the Diwan, Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab ensured that the financial foundation of the state was a permanent,
impartial institution, not the personal decision of a ruler or a provincial governor. He built a system that was designed to outlast any single individual. And this is what created that predictable, stable framework that allowed the state to not only survive its rapid growth, but to thrive, to build a civilization, and to administer justice on a scale the world had rarely seen before. And this brings us to our final question, something to really think about. This moment in history forces us to reflect on the nature of what true leadership is. You know, it's one thing for a leader to create systems that concentrate power and serve their own immediate needs, but it takes a far more profound vision, a deeper humility, and an unshakable commitment to justice to build impartial institutions that will continue to serve the public good long, long after that leader is gone. It really is the difference between building a personal legacy and building a constitutional one. If you found this explainer valuable, please subscribe to our channel and like this video, and please also share this video with your friends. Thank you.
Expanding state. I mean, it's growing faster than anyone could have imagined. You've got new territories, incredible new wealth, but with that comes a massive challenge. How do you actually fund all of this? How do you manage it all without just, well, crushing the very people you're supposed to be governing? That was the huge question facing the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab.
And the answer he came up with was truly revolutionary. It was an institution called the Diwān al-Kharāj. Now, don't let the name fool you. This wasn't just some dusty old treasury department. No, this was way more profound. It was basically a constitution for public money. A whole new system designed from the ground up to handle the state's finances with justice and accountability right at its heart.
Yeah, so the goal here went way beyond just grabbing cash. It was all about creating a system that was predictable, that was transparent, and that was based on rules, not on the whims of whoever was in charge. A framework that would keep the state stable, for sure, but also one that would protect the rights and, importantly, the dignity of its people. I mean, this was a massive shift from just arbitrary rule to what we'd now call institutional governance.
So how did this thing actually work? What made it tick? Well, it was all built on a set of really powerful legal principles that actually limited the state's power and laid out clear rules for everybody. This is the core idea of something we call fiscal constitutionalism.
And it stood on four main pillars, which, when you put them together, created this amazing system of checks and balances. First, and this is huge, revenue was based on law, not just what a local governor felt like collecting that day. Second, they separated the jobs. The people who assessed the tax were different from the people who collected it, who were different from the people who audited it. Smart, right? It's a classic way to fight corruption. Third, everything, and I mean everything, was written down. Meticulous records, receipts, this paperwork was actual evidence. And finally, it all fed into a central treasury, the Bayt al-Māl, which oversaw the whole process to make sure everyone was playing by the same rules.
And all of that brings us back to this key concept, fiscal constitutionalism. It sounds complicated, but it's actually a pretty simple and really profound idea. It just means that a government's power to tax isn't unlimited. It has to be tied to clear laws, it has to be recorded, and it has to be open to review. In other words, the government has to follow its own rules.
Okay, so you've got these incredible rules in place, but the system still needs a reliable, sustainable source of revenue to actually work. And this leads us to what might be the single most important economic decision of that entire era. And it all came down to one thing: land. So here was the dilemma. As new lands came into the state, the tradition, the way it had always been done, was to divide it all up among the victorious soldiers as spoils of war. But a totally different idea started to take shape. What if the land wasn't carved up for a few? What if it was kept as a public asset, a kind of trust, for the benefit of the entire community, not just for now, but for generations to come?
I mean, just think about the stakes here. Option 1, you give the land to the soldiers. They're happy, they're rewarded, but you risk creating a new class of super rich landowners, and you could end up kicking all the local farmers off their land. Option 2, you keep it as public property. This would create a steady, long-term income stream to fund everything the state needed to do for everybody. The only downside, it completely went against tradition. Well, Umar chose the second path. He declared the land a public trust. And honestly, this was a visionary move. It basically guaranteed the financial health of the state for generations, it protected the public good, it made sure the food supply wasn't disrupted by keeping experienced farmers on their land, and it provided this incredible stability across the board. But this system wasn't just about clever rules and smart economics. There was something deeper going on. It was also built on a really powerful ethical foundation that put human dignity right at the center of how the state dealt with money. The first principle was all about fairness. This quote is basically a rule for progressive taxation. The idea that you should only contribute what you can actually afford. The state's needs could never, ever be an excuse to financially ruin an individual. Now, just stop and think about how revolutionary this is for a second. The process of collecting taxes mattered just as much as the tax itself. It couldn't be a source of shame or degradation. The taxpayer, even as they were paying their dues to the state, had to be treated with respect. And finally, this one is crystal clear. There was a strict, absolute ban on using force or violence. The collection of money for the state had to be peaceful and it had to be just. This ethical code wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a nice to have, it was the law. So what this ethical framework did was truly remarkable. It completely changed the game. Taxation wasn't just the state taking its cut anymore. It became a kind of constitutional duty, governed by mutual responsibility. The whole system was built on the idea that a government's financial legitimacy, its very right to collect taxes, depends on upholding the dignity of its people. So as we start to wrap this up, it becomes pretty obvious that these ideas from history aren't just historical. They're really timeless principles for what makes for fair and accountable government, and they are just as relevant today as they were 1,400 years ago. So let's just recap the 3 big ideas to take away from all this. First, law has to come before power. A state's financial policy has to be tied to clear, fair rules, not just the whims of its leaders. Second, public wealth is a powerful idea. Key assets, like land, can be managed as a public trust for everyone's benefit, not just for a select few. And third, and maybe most importantly, ethical governance is the foundation. The dignity of every single individual has to be protected, even and especially when it comes to taxes. And that really just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. In our world today, with all our complex economies and endless debates about what's fair when it comes to taxation, what can this ancient blueprint for fiscal justice really teach us about building more equitable, more accountable, and more humane systems? It sounds familiar. These aren't just today's headlines. These are the age-old problems that governments have always struggled with. You know, that feeling that the system is rigged, that officials are basically untouchable, or that your hard-earned money is just disappearing into a black hole. When that happens, the trust between people and their government just crumbles. So, what if I told you that a surprisingly sophisticated framework to tackle these exact problems was put together way back in the early days of the Islamic State? We're about to explore a system that made accountability and justice its top priorities, long before anyone had even dreamed of spreadsheets or digital banking. At the very heart of this system was an institution called the Diwān al-Kharāj. Now, don't just think of this as some dusty old treasury for counting coins. It was so much more than that. It was really the constitutional spine of the government's entire financial system. Its whole purpose wasn't just to rake in money, but to manage it with a clear, built-in sense of justice and public duty. Okay, so how did it actually work? I mean, the really wild thing here is just how modern this all feels. Let's walk through it. First, you've got assessment. Taxes weren't just made up, they were based on how productive the land actually was. Fair, right? Second, collection. This was organized, scheduled, and, get this, everyone got a receipt. It was all documented. Third, reporting. Local areas got to use the funds to meet their own needs first, and only the surplus went to the center. Then you have audits and appeals. There were ways to review officials and for regular people to actually have their complaints heard and fixed. These are the kinds of checks and balances we talk about today. And here's the kicker. The whole thing was designed to be basically corruption-proof. Working in the revenue office was considered a public trust, an amana. Giving gifts to officials? Absolutely forbidden. If some officials suddenly got suspiciously wealthy, you better believe an investigation was launched. And there was no job security for bad actors. Abusive officials were out, period. The most important thing to get here is that this wasn't just a list of nice ideas or moral suggestions. This was institutionalized anti-corruption law. And this slide right here is where it all just clicks. Look at this comparison. A system for assessment and collection, today we call that a tax authority. A central treasury, the Bayt al-Māl, that's basically a finance ministry. Audits and accountability, we have entire auditing agencies for that. Moving money between the provinces and the center, that's the whole idea behind modern federal budgets. It is, literally, a prototype for modern government, just built in the 7th century. It's incredible. Okay, so it was organized, it was efficient, it was accountable. That's all very impressive. But what's the real test for any government, right? It's not how it works on a good day. It's how it performs under pressure. What happens when a real crisis hits, say, a massive famine? And this is where the Diwān al-Kharāj really showed what it was made of. In a crisis, it wasn't just an administrative office anymore. It became a life-saving constitutional structure. Because that's the thing. Having a stable, trustworthy financial system already in place is exactly what allows a government to actually respond when people are in desperate need.
Let's take that famine example. Because the system was ready, the state could act immediately. The money was there in the treasury to buy food and arrange to get it to people. But just as important, the aid was distributed fairly, and everything was recorded to make sure it got to the people who actually needed it. The system wasn't just about accounting. It was about saving lives and doing it with integrity.
The framework also had this brilliant political effect. It created a really smart balance of power. The provinces weren't just cash cows for the capital city. They kept enough funds to handle their own local needs. At the same time, the central government had the resources to manage national priorities. This clever setup stopped the center from becoming a tyranny, and it kept the provinces from wanting to break away. It was a functioning federal system with accountability baked right in.
And all of this brings us to the ultimate point, the single most important goal of the whole enterprise. Caliph Umar didn't set up this complex system just to get rich or build a powerful empire. The number one reason, the whole philosophy behind every single rule, was to institutionalize justice, to build fairness right into the DNA of the government.
So why does any of this matter to us now, 1,400 years later? Well, because these lessons are completely timeless. The idea that taxes should be based on law, not on the whims of a powerful leader. That government officials have to be auditable, that no one is above the law. That treating citizens with dignity isn't optional, it's a core part of justice. And that public money should bring people together, not drive them apart.
Ultimately, this ancient blueprint leaves us with this one powerful, enduring idea. Public money is a trust. It's a sacred trust. And to honor that trust, you need a lot more than just good intentions. You need law, you need records, and you need accountability. That's a lesson that was true